The Martins moved into their cozy suburban home with dreams of raising their two children, Emily, age 6, and Ethan, age 4, in a safe, friendly environment. Their house sat in the middle of a picturesque neighborhood lined with manicured lawns and quaint, tree-lined streets. At first glance, it seemed idyllic. The homeowner association had a reputation for maintaining high standards of community aesthetics, which was one of the reasons the Martins chose the neighborhood. However, they had no idea how this homeowner association would come to dominate their lives. The Martins were an ordinary family. Laura, the mother, worked part-time as an elementary school teacher, while her husband, David, was a systems analyst with a local tech firm. Their children spent most afternoons playing in the backyard, chasing each other with plastic swords or inventing fantastical worlds. It was during one of these play sessions that Laura first noticed the issue. The backyard, while spacious, was completely open, offering little privacy from neighboring properties. The Martins' lot backed onto a community park, which was wonderful for the kids during the day, but less so when joggers, dog walkers, and curious neighbors peered into their yard at all hours. Their immediate neighbors also seemed overly interested in their lives. Miss Bradley, from 2 houses down, frequently commented on how long the grass was growing or how noisy the children were during playtime. There were times when Laura felt as though their family was under constant surveillance. It wasn't long before Laura brought up the idea of installing a privacy fence. "It's not just for us," she told David as they discussed it over dinner one evening. "It's for the kids. They deserve to play outside without us worrying about strangers staring at them or neighbors keeping tabs on every little thing we do." David, though hesitant at first due to the cost, eventually agreed. "Let's make sure we get the homeowner association's approval," he said. "The last thing we need is to break one of their rules." The next morning, David logged into the homeowner association's online portal and submitted a detailed proposal. He included blueprints showing the fence's height, materials, and exact location. Within a week, they received an email from the homeowner association board. It was short and to the point. Approved. Please ensure compliance with community standards as outlined in Article 12, Section 5 of the Homeowner Association Guidelines. With the green light from the homeowner association, the Martins hired a contractor and scheduled the installation. The project went smoothly. Over the course of 3 days, the wooden privacy fence took shape, enclosing their backyard and creating a safe, secluded area for their family. The Martins were thrilled. Laura decorated the fence with hanging flower pots, and the kids quickly claimed the space as their own, dragging out their toys and setting up a miniature picnic table. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. The Martins finally had the privacy they craved, and the kids could play without interruption. Even Miss Bradley seemed to approve, offering a curt nod when she saw the finished fence. But the peace didn't last. 2 weeks after the fence was installed, the Martins received an unexpected letter in the mail. It bore the homeowner association's official letterhead and a foreboding subject line, "Notice of violation and hearing." Confused, Laura opened the envelope and read aloud, "Dear Mr. and Miss Martin, it has come to our attention that the recently installed fence at your property is in violation of community standards. Specifically, the fence obstructs the view of the community park from adjacent properties, thereby diminishing the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. You are hereby required to remove the fence or reduce its height to 3 feet within 30 days to avoid penalties. Failure to comply will result in a daily fine of $100. Sincerely, the Homeowner Association Compliance Committee." Laura was stunned. "This doesn't make any sense," she said, handing the letter to David. "They approved the fence. How can it suddenly be a violation?" David reread the letter, his jaw tightening. "It's ridiculous. The whole point of the fence is privacy. A 3-foot fence is practically useless." Later that evening, David called the Homeowner Association office for clarification. After waiting on hold for 20 minutes, he was connected to a board member named Karen Whitmore. Karen had a reputation in the neighborhood for being strict and inflexible when it came to homeowner association rules. David explained the situation, emphasizing that the fence had been approved before installation. "Yes, Mr. Martin, I see the approval here," Karen said, her voice cold and clinical. However, new concerns have been raised by a neighbor regarding the fence's impact on their property value in view of the park. As such, the homeowner association has reevaluated the situation and determined that the fence does not comply with community guidelines. David's frustration boiled over. Who raised these concerns? And why does one person's opinion override the homeowner association's original approval? I'm not at liberty to disclose the complainant's identity, Karen replied. But I assure you the board's decision is final. You may present your case at the upcoming hearing, but I recommend preparing to comply with the outlined requirements. When David relayed the conversation to Laura, her frustration matched his. They couldn't understand how the homeowner association could approve the fence one moment and demand its removal the next. It wasn't until a few days later, when a construction crew arrived at the vacant lot next door, that they began to piece things together. The lot belonged to Mr. Anderson, a wealthy real estate investor who had recently purchased the property. His construction crew was laying the foundation for a sprawling mansion, complete with expansive windows and a wraparound balcony that overlooked the community park and the Martins' backyard. The timing of his complaint was too coincidental to be ignored. Laura was furious. This isn't about the fence being a violation. It's about Mr. Anderson wanting an unobstructed view from his mansion. He's using the homeowner association to bully us into doing what he wants. David agreed. But what can we do? They're threatening us with fines, and we don't have the money to fight this. The Martins spent the next week gathering evidence, including the original approval email from the homeowner association and photos of their fence. Meanwhile, the construction of Mr. Anderson's mansion continued unabated. Laura couldn't help but feel the deck was stacked against them. The homeowner association, it seemed, was more interested in catering to the whims of wealthy investors than protecting the rights of ordinary residents. The Martins weren't going to back down without a fight, but they had no idea just how far the homeowner association and Mr. Anderson would go to assert their authority. The letter from the homeowner association sat on the Martins' kitchen counter, an unwelcome reminder of the brewing conflict. Laura stared at it as she sipped her coffee, frustration bubbling under her calm exterior. She had reread the notice countless times, trying to make sense of how their approved fence had suddenly become a violation. Every time she thought about the words "obstructs the view," her stomach churned. The Martins hadn't built the fence to block anyone's view, they'd built it to protect their privacy. And yet, here they were, branded as rule breakers in their own neighborhood. David entered the kitchen, scanning his phone. "I've been looking up stories about homeowner associations," he said, his tone a mix of exhaustion and determination. "This kind of thing happens all the time. There's a story about a family fined for having flower pots that didn't match the homeowner association's color scheme. Another one had to remove their kid's basketball hoop because it was considered distracting. This isn't just us." Laura set her coffee down. "But it is us now. What are we supposed to do? We can't afford to pay $100 a day in fines, and I don't want to take down the fence. The kids love it. I love it. It's our backyard, for God's sake." David sighed. "We have the hearing in 2 weeks. That gives us time to figure out our case. We need to show them the original approval and make it clear this is on record. If they want to argue about the fence now, they'll need to explain why it was okay before." Laura nodded, but her confidence wavered. The homeowner association wasn't just some neighbor with a grudge, it was an entire system with rules, power, and the ability to make life miserable for anyone who crossed it. She wasn't sure how much of a chance they had. The days that followed were filled with tension. The Martins tried to go about their normal routines, but the stress of the upcoming hearing hung over them like a storm cloud. Every time Laura looked out the window and saw their fence, she felt a pang of anxiety. It was a symbol of safety and privacy for her family. But now it felt like a target. To make matters worse, construction on Mr. Anderson's mansion was progressing rapidly. The crew worked long hours, hammering and sawing as the framework of the house took shape. The massive structure loomed over the Martins' backyard, and Laura couldn't help but notice how the balcony seemed perfectly positioned to take in the view of the community park once the Martins' fence was gone. One afternoon, Laura decided to visit the homeowner association office in person. She wanted to see if she could get more information about their case and maybe find out who had complained about the fence. The office was located in a small, nondescript building near the neighborhood's entrance. Inside, a receptionist greeted her with a professional but distant smile. "I'd like to speak to someone about a violation notice we received," Laura said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's about our backyard fence." The receptionist typed something into her computer and then looked up. "You'll need to speak with Karen Whitmore, our compliance officer. She's currently in a meeting, but I can schedule an appointment for you." "Actually," Laura said, leaning forward slightly, "I just need some clarification. Is there any way you can tell me who filed the complaint about our fence?" The receptionist's smile tightened. "I'm sorry, Ma, I am, but that information is confidential. If you have questions about the process, you can bring them up during your hearing." Frustrated, Laura left the office feeling no closer to answers. It was as if the homeowner association operated behind a wall of secrecy, shielding itself from accountability. That evening, David came home with some unexpected news. "I talked to Jeff from down the street," he said. Jeff was a lawyer who lived a few blocks away and often helped neighbors with minor legal issues. He's willing to look over the documents we have and give us some advice. The Martins gathered all the paperwork related to the fence, the original approval email, the designs they had submitted, and photos of the completed structure. Jeff arrived later that night and spread everything out on the dining room table. "This approval email is solid," Jeff said, pointing to the document. "It clearly states that the homeowner association gave you permission to build the fence. If they're claiming it's a violation now, they need to justify why their original decision has changed. And this part about obstructing the view, that's subjective. There's no clear standard for what constitutes a view in their guidelines." Laura felt a flicker of hope. "So we have a case?" "You do," Jeff said, "but it's not a slam dunk. Homeowner associations have a lot of power, and they're notorious for bending their own rules to suit their interests. You'll need to be prepared to argue your case carefully and calmly. Keep it about the facts, the approval, the lack of any real guideline you violated, and the impact this has on your family." David nodded. "What about the fines? Can they really charge us $100 a day?" "They can try," Jeff said. "But if you challenge the violation and win, those fines should be dismissed. The key is to stand your ground and not let them intimidate you into compliance." As the hearing date approached, the Martins found themselves preparing like they were heading into battle. Laura printed copies of every document they had and organized them into a binder. David practiced what he would say, focusing on presenting their case logically and calmly. They even wrote down potential counter-arguments the homeowner association might use and rehearsed how to respond. Meanwhile, the construction on Mr. Anderson's mansion continued at a relentless pace. One afternoon, Laura saw him standing on the edge of the construction site, talking with the foreman. She considered walking over and confronting him, but she decided against it. This wasn't just about him, it was about the entire system that allowed people like him to bend the rules to their will. The final straw came a few days before the hearing, when Laura received a call from Miss Bradley. "I don't mean to pry," Miss Bradley said, her voice dripping with folks' concern, "but I heard about your little issue with the homeowner association. Such a shame. I always thought your fence was a bit much, though. It does stick out, doesn't it?" Laura clenched her jaw. "Thanks for your input, Miss Bradley. We'll handle it." After hanging up, Laura turned to David. "I'm done being polite about this," she said. "They're trying to push us around, but we're not going to let them." David put a hand on her shoulder. "We're ready for this. They don't know who they're dealing with." The night before the hearing, Laura and David sat in their living room, going over their notes one last time. The tension was palpable, but so was their determination. They had built their fence to protect their family, and they weren't going to let the homeowner association or anyone else take that away from them without a fight. The day of the hearing arrived, and the Martins woke up feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. David dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and Laura chose a conservative dress, wanting to present themselves as calm, reasonable, and responsible homeowners. They packed their meticulously prepared binder of documents, evidence, and photos, ready to face the homeowner association head-on. The hearing was held in the small community center located near the neighborhood park. When the Martins arrived, they were directed to a conference room where the homeowner association board members sat behind a long table. There were 5 of them, including Karen Whitmore, who had been the Martins' primary point of contact throughout the ordeal. She sat at the center, her demeanor as rigid as her gray blazer. To her right was the association's president, Mr. McAllister, an older man with an air of self-importance. To her left were 2 other board members, including a younger woman who barely looked up from her notes. The Martins took their seats across from the board. A few other homeowners had gathered in the audience, likely curious about the drama that had been unfolding over the past weeks. Laura scanned the room, but Mr. Anderson was conspicuously absent. "Let's begin," Karen said, tapping her pen against a stack of papers. "This is a hearing to address the violation notice issued to the Martins regarding their backyard fence. The issue at hand is whether the fence complies with the community standards set forth by the homeowner association." David leaned forward. "We'd like to begin by presenting our evidence," he said firmly. "This includes the original approval we received from the homeowner association." Karen raised an eyebrow. "You may proceed." David opened the binder and handed copies of the approval email to each board member. This email clearly states that our fence design was approved by the board prior to construction. It met all the guidelines outlined in the homeowner association's documentation. Karen glanced at the email, her face unreadable. Mr. McAllister adjusted his glasses and frowned. "Yes, we see the approval," he said. "But the issue now is the impact the fence has on the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. As you know, community standards evolve, and the board reserves the right to reassess previous decisions." Laura couldn't hold back any longer. "So, you're telling us that our fence was fine 2 months ago, but now, because of one complaint, it's suddenly a problem? That's not how this should work. We followed the rules. We got your approval." Karen cleared her throat. The complaint in question was raised by a neighboring property owner who believes the fence obstructs the view of the community park and negatively affects property values. The board has a duty to address such concerns. "And who filed this complaint?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. "We have a right to know who's accusing us of violating the rules." Karen hesitated. "The identity of the complainant is confidential." "Confidential?" Laura shot back. "Everyone knows it's Mr. Anderson. He's building a mansion next door, and our fence is in the way of his precious view. This isn't about the community, it's about one person with influence trying to get his way." There was a murmur from the small audience. A few homeowners exchanged knowing glances. Karen shifted uncomfortably but remained composed. "The board cannot discuss the motivations of individual complainants," she said. "Our focus is on whether the fence complies with community standards." David took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. "Let's talk about those standards," he said. "We reviewed the homeowner association's guidelines extensively before building the fence. There's nothing in the rules about maintaining sightlines to the park. If you're going to enforce this, you need to show us exactly which guideline we violated." Karen opened a thick binder in front of her and flipped through the pages. "The guidelines state that all exterior structures must not detract from the overall aesthetic of the neighborhood." "That's vague," David countered. "It's open to interpretation, and it doesn't specifically apply to our fence. If you're going to penalize us, you need to have a concrete reason, not just someone's opinion." Mr. McAllister interjected. "The board's role is to ensure harmony within the community. When one homeowner's decisions impact others, we have to act. That's the purpose of the homeowner association." "And what about our harmony?" Laura asked, her voice rising slightly. "We built this fence to protect our family's privacy. Without it, anyone walking in the park can see straight into our backyard. We have young children. Are we supposed to sacrifice their safety and comfort because one person doesn't like the view?" The younger woman on the board finally spoke up, her voice tentative. "Miss Martin makes a valid point. Privacy is important, and it's not unreasonable to want a fence in your backyard. Perhaps there's a compromise we can reach." Karen shot her a sharp look, but the woman didn't back down. "We've approved similar fences in the past," she continued, "and if the Martins followed the rules, it seems unfair to penalize them now." Laura seized the opportunity. "Exactly. We're not asking for special treatment. We just want to keep what we've already built. The board approved it. We invested time and money into this project because we trusted the process. The discussion continued for over an hour, with the Martins presenting their case and the board members debating amongst themselves. Laura and David remained composed, carefully refuting each argument and pointing out inconsistencies in the board's reasoning. At one point, David brought up photos of other fences in the neighborhood that were similar to theirs but hadn't been called into question. "Why is our fence being singled out?" he asked. "Is it because our neighbor happens to be a wealthy investor?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Karen shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. McAllister frowned but said nothing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Karen called for a short recess so the board could deliberate. Laura and David stepped outside to catch their breath. The tension was palpable, but they felt a flicker of hope. They had presented a strong case, and the audience's murmurs of agreement suggested they weren't alone in their frustrations. When the board reconvened, Karen delivered the verdict. After careful consideration, the board has decided to rescind the daily fines associated with the fence. However, we maintain that the fence does not fully comply with community standards and recommend a modification to reduce its height. Laura started to protest, but David placed a hand on her arm. "It's a partial win," he said quietly. "We'll figure out the next step." As they left the hearing, several neighbors approached them, offering words of support. "You did great in there," one woman said. "It's about time someone stood up to the homeowner association." While the fight wasn't entirely over, the Martins felt a sense of victory. They had stood their ground and forced the homeowner association to acknowledge their mistakes. But as they walked back to their car, Laura couldn't help but wonder, would the homeowner association ever stop bending the rules to serve their own interests? The Martins returned home from the homeowner association hearing with mixed emotions. While they had managed to avoid the crippling daily fines, the board's decision to demand modifications to the fence still felt like a loss. Laura sat at the kitchen table that evening, staring at the verdict letter while David paced the room. "We can't let this end here," Laura said finally, breaking the silence. "They admitted their mistake about the fines, but they're still trying to control us. This isn't just about a fence anymore, it's about fairness." David nodded, his frustration still simmering. "I agree, but what's our next move? We've pushed them to back down on the fines, but they're still clinging to this nonsense about the fence height." "We fight back," Laura said firmly. "Not just for us, but for every family in this neighborhood that's been bullied by the homeowner association." Over the next few days, Laura and David began reaching out to their neighbors, sharing their story, and asking if anyone else had faced similar issues with the homeowner association. To their surprise, they found that many residents had their own grievances. Miss Alvarez, who lived a few doors down, revealed that the homeowner association had fined her for planting roses that weren't an approved color. Mr. Patel, an elderly man on the next street, had been ordered to repaint his mailbox 3 times because the shade of green he used was deemed too bright. Even Jeff, the lawyer who had helped the Martins, mentioned that his request to install solar panels had been denied without explanation. Encouraged by the support, Laura and David decided to take their fight public. They organized a neighborhood meeting at the community park, inviting all the residents to share their stories. Dozens of people showed up, and what began as a small gathering quickly turned into a rally. One by one, neighbors stepped forward to recount how the homeowner association had harassed or mistreated them. "This isn't about protecting the neighborhood anymore," Mr. Patel said, his voice trembling with emotion. "It's about power. They use the rules to control us, not to help us." The Martins listened intently, taking notes and promising to bring these stories to the next homeowner association board meeting. By the end of the evening, they had a list of over 20 grievances and a growing coalition of residents ready to demand change. Armed with their newfound support, the Martins prepared for the next board meeting. This time, they weren't just defending their own case, they were representing the entire community. Laura created a presentation outlining the homeowner association's history of arbitrary rule enforcement, complete with documented cases and photos provided by the neighbors. David drafted a formal petition calling for an overhaul of the board's leadership and policies, which had been signed by nearly 50 residents. When the day of the meeting arrived, the Martins walked into the room with a sense of purpose. The atmosphere was tense. The Homeowner Association board members sat stiffly behind their table, their expressions unreadable. Karen Whitmore glanced nervously at the growing crowd of residents filing into the room. "This meeting has been called to address community concerns," Mr. McAllister began, his tone clipped. "The floor is open for comments." David stood first, his voice calm but firm. "We're here because this board has consistently failed to serve the interests of this community. Instead of protecting homeowners, you've used your authority to impose arbitrary fines, enforce vague rules, and cater to the preferences of a select few." Laura followed, presenting the grievances collected from their neighbors. Each case painted a damning picture of a homeowner association more interested in control than fairness. As she spoke, murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. When she finished, Karen tried to regain control of the meeting. "These accusations are unfounded," she said, her voice taut. "The board acts in accordance with the community guidelines, which are in place to maintain the neighborhood's standards." "But who enforces those guidelines?" Laura shot back. "You do. And you've been enforcing them inconsistently, unfairly, and often without justification. We're not here to dismantle the homeowner association, we're here to fix it." The meeting reached its climax when Jeff, the lawyer, stepped forward. "As a resident and an attorney, I've reviewed the homeowner association's bylaws extensively," he said. "I've found numerous instances where this board has overstepped its authority. If these practices continue, you may be facing legal action from this community." Karen's face paled, and even Mr. McAllister seemed taken aback. The room buzzed with tension as residents began voicing their agreement. The board was clearly on the defensive, and it became evident that their usual tactics of intimidation wouldn't work this time. Finally, after hours of heated discussion, the board agreed to a compromise. They promised to waive the demand for the Martins to modify their fence and committed to reviewing the guidelines with input from the community. Additionally, a vote was scheduled for the following month to elect new board members, giving the residents a chance to reshape the homeowner association's leadership. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to change. The Martins' fence stayed exactly as it was, standing as a symbol of resilience and fairness. The election brought in a mix of new board members, including Jeff and Miss Alvarez, who pledged to prioritize transparency and community input. For the Martins, the ordeal had been exhausting, but it also brought unexpected rewards. They had strengthened their ties with their neighbors and helped spark a movement that would benefit the entire community. One afternoon, as Laura watched Emily and Ethan play in their fenced-in backyard, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fight had been worth it not just for her family's privacy, but for the principle that no one should feel powerless in their own home. David joined her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "We did it," he said softly. "We stood up to them, and we won." Laura smiled, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. "We didn't just win," she said. "We made things better for everyone." As the sun set over the neighborhood, the Martins' fence cast long shadows across their backyard. It was no longer just a barrier, it was a reminder of what could be achieved when people stood together against unfairness. And for the first time in months, Laura felt at peace.